Well, to get further insight on this, we can speak now to Associate Professor of History and Director of the Middle East Centre at the University of Utah, Mr. Michael Lowe. Mr. Lowe, I know you have a book that is soon to be published called Saltwater Kingdoms, which outlines the major role of desalination plants in the region. Do you think they're becoming somewhat the main bargaining chip almost in this war?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, they've sort of climbed to the top of the escalation ladder. In particular for Iran, they understand the sort of vital nature of these facilities for their Gulf neighbors. I think one of the things that is most upsetting and disappointing about the comments that President Donald Trump made is that Iran really only relies on desalination for about 3% of its water. So it's not nearly the same sort of existential risk for Iran that it is for the other Gulf states.
Indeed, some of the Gulf states, I believe 99% of drinking water in Qatar, 70% of drinking water in Saudi Arabia comes from these desalination plants. So how dangerous are things getting on that level for people in the region?
I mean, I think for them, this is actually, so if we look at the sort of main things that are under threat in this war, civilian infrastructures of basically all kinds, obviously the economic sensitivity globally is around oil infrastructure. Israel has heavily bombarded Iranian nuclear sites, in particular the power plant at Bushehr, right? But for Iran, the sort of critical weapon against the Gulf is, of course, the desalination plants. In fact, I'm sort of making the argument that it's sort of raised to a level that's even greater than sort of nuclear threats, which is sort of an interesting role reversal in this particular conflict.
So, if a desalination plant is hit there, I mean, how quickly do things become impossible for people to live in the region, and how long does one get a plant of that kind back up and running?
Sure. I mean, I think that the real difficulty is if you take these plants out of the supply chain, right? It could take days, weeks, months to recover that capacity. So I would sort of put these countries into sort of two separate categories, right? So the smaller countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, they don't have the same strategic depth as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, right? So as the figures that you presented earlier suggest, these countries are less dependent on desalinated water. In particular, Saudi Arabia has a sort of a larger territory, larger supply of groundwater. And then the other part is just their sort of ability to sort of make up capacity, right? So in October, I was able to visit with the Saudi Water Authority and the Saline Water Conversion Corporation. And one of the things that they really stressed to me was their backup, their reserve capacity, the ability to flow water to a needed region, right? Under normal circumstances, you might have a situation where you have pilgrims coming to Mecca and you have a seasonal spike in demand and you need to sort of flow more resources from one set of plants to the other. Saudi Arabia has over 14,000 kilometers of water transmission pipelines, right? So we've talked a lot about oil transmission, right? The east-west pipeline connecting the Persian Gulf with the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia also has strategic depth in terms of its water pipeline system. So I think the same thing goes for the UAE, right? They have reserve capacity in the Liwa Oasis. They've basically pumped desalinated water underground to provide a multi-month supply. I was actually checking in after the attack on the Doha West power and desalination plant about reserve capacity for Kuwait. And as best as I can tell, you've got about a week strategic reserve for a place like Kuwait. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, a sort of eerie callback to the past is Kuwait suffered this before in 1990-91 when Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded. They actually purposefully sabotaged desalination, power plants, oil wells, caused an oil slick in the Gulf, and basically had a strategy of ecological terror. So we've actually seen this play out in the past, and that was a catastrophe for Kuwait that had very immediate impacts on their water supply, but has really left lasting scars on that society and economy for years and even decades after that event.
It does sound like they're still quite vulnerable when it comes to that. And, you know, these plants, they're really vast areas of land. Are they well protected? I mean, or are they quite easy targets?
I mean, these are soft targets. This is municipal infrastructure. I think one of the worries that I've been thinking about throughout this conflict is that, for example, if you were to look at an aerial photograph of a place like Dubai, right? Most of us know Dubai via the Burj Al Arab or the Burj Khalifa, the Palm, the sort of signature tourist infrastructures, the airport, things like that. But if you actually look to one side, you have this sort of vast industrial complex and port at Jebel Ali. And this is very characteristic where you'll have conjoined power and desalination plants, port facilities, in some cases, oil refining capacity. So you have lots of different infrastructures, aluminum plants, things like that, that are lined up one next to the other. So even if Iran doesn't pursue a concerted strategy to hit those plants, there may be incidental fire taken from drones and missiles. And I think we've seen a few incidences of that throughout the war thus far. So I think that's sort of one of my worries, is that even if you don't have this sort of, concerted strategy on Iran's part, you may have incidental damage.
And the desalination plants, they are, of course, run by fossil fuels, by petrol. So is that already impacting supplies?
I think no. The amount of fossil fuels needed to run these plants, depending on how you slice it, you could take figures of between 10 to 20% for a country like Saudi Arabia of fossil fuels that are produced every day are used in order to power electrical and desalination functions. So there's plenty of spare capacity, I think, to make up any eventuality in that case. But again, the real worry is not if one plant goes offline. I think the real worry is if Iran were to sort of climb the escalation ladder even further and decide to attack multiple plants, right? If you were able to take out all of the Saudi plants on the Persian Gulf coast or all of Kuwait's plants, then you wouldn't have that spare capacity to sort of make up.
Yeah, and people would be in direct jeopardy. Michael Christopher Lowe, thanks so much for your time and bringing us your insight here on France 24. Very much appreciated.